We're back with the inspiring story of a couple. Doctors told them their baby may not live a month or even a week.
It's because their son was born without a brain, only a brain stem. Baby Joshua continued to defy the odds. We first shared his story last year. He turned 2 last month, but passed away last Tuesday. 13 News reporter David Ham joins us now. And David, how did the parents deal with this?
Well, they knew the prognosis wasn't good. They knew that his body could give up at any time. They said this was about loving Josiah's soul. We first met Josiah Ethan White last Father's Day, bright and bubbly at 16 months old.
And then his second birthday came around, and it's like, wow, he's getting better.
Extremely promising for a boy who doctors said had a slim chance of survival. Josiah was born without a brain, only a brain stem. Rachel and Eric White say their faith led them to adopt Josiah.
It was just a conviction of the heart. God called us to do that.
And every time we would go to the doctors after that, they would just look at us and say, "We don't understand how this is happening. It's not possible for him to be alive, but he is, so enjoy every moment."
Every moment.
And we have been.
Last Tuesday, Josiah stopped breathing and died. Rachel was away from home and got a call from their home nurse.
Okay, I can't breathe right now, but I know that we're in God's hands.
Eric was serving in the Air Force in Afghanistan. Within 30 hours, he was back home in Hampton.
It wasn't just him being defeated by the condition, it was just his time to go.
Josiah survived 2 years, 1 month and 4 days.
That little boy has changed our lives. We're not the same, and we'll never be the same, ever again.
We're loving his soul,
Yeah.
and his soul is still a part of our family, and it's always going to be a part of our family.
Though Rachel and Eric adopted Josiah as a special needs child, they say Josiah ended up giving them much more than they could ever do for him.
He taught me more about life in 2 years than I could have taught him in 18. I guarantee that.
The Whites plan to spread Josiah's ashes in a garden with a dogwood tree. His memorial service will be held this Sunday at Coastal Community Church in Yorktown. His family says that everyone is welcome. David Ham, 13 News.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you and welcome you all to tonight's presentation. Before I start, can I ask all of you to switch off your mobiles, and please don't take any pictures or recordings. I'd like to thank everyone attending, and I'd like to thank Professor Van Lommel and Dr. Azmayesh for providing us with a valuable time tonight in order to discuss the topic of endless consciousness. Tonight's program will begin with a 60-minute presentation by Professor Van Lommel on endless consciousness. Professor Van Lommel is a world-renowned cardiologist and researcher in the field of near-death experiences. He has written many articles on the relation between consciousness and the brain. His work has been published in renowned journals such as The Lancet, and his book entitled Endless Consciousness was a bestseller in 2008 in Holland, and has since been translated to many languages. I'm sure in tonight's presentation he will touch on many of the main themes of his research and provide us with many thoughtful ideas. After Professor Van Lommel's presentation, I'm delighted that Dr. Azmayesh has also agreed to provide us with a brief 20-minute presentation on the topic of endless consciousness from the Gnostic point of view. Dr. Azmayesh has 2 doctorates, one in law and another in comparative religions. He's also a famous researcher in the field of Gnostic traditions, and he himself is a well-known Sufi master. Tonight in his presentation he will shine a light on the topic of consciousness from a Gnostic point of view. I'm sure you'll find the contrast and similarities between the Gnostic view on consciousness and Professor Van Lommel's scientific studies on consciousness also of great interest. After the presentations, there will be an open discussion forum, where both Professor Van Lommel and Dr. Azmayesh will open to taking questions from the audience. I have in the past generally found this part of the presentation of great interest, as the audience opinions and questions have always generated thought-provoking ideas. So now I'm going to hand over tonight's proceedings to Professor Van Lommel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today in London, together with Dr. Asmayesh, the concept of the continuity of consciousness based on scientific research on near-death experiences, NDE, in survivors of cardiac arrest. In human history, the question has always been asked, could there be consciousness beyond the brain? And how could new research on the continuity of consciousness could affect the understanding of life, death, the structure of reality, and the possibility of a so-called afterlife? An NDE, or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma, still gives rise to many unbelieving and critical questions. But as already 1 century ago William James had said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories from a period of obvious unconsciousness? Or how is it possible that permanent life changes occur after cardiac arrest of only 2 minutes? An NDE is an unforgettable confrontation with unlimited dimensions in our consciousness. As long as one not has experienced an NDE himself, it seems impossible to really understand the impact and the life-changing after effects of this overwhelming experience. The existing worldview has radically changed. Quote, "It felt as if I had become another person, but with the same identity." Another quote, "You can be physically dead, but your mind lives on. Only one thing matters, your attitude toward other people. I accept life as it is, and I am no longer afraid of death." I will not only talk about changes in consciousness during or after an NDE, but above all, I want to discuss my ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Important questions for me were, how is consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? Is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? Is there a biological basis of consciousness anyway? We can distinguish between both temporary and timeless aspects of our consciousness. This prompts the following question. Is it possible to speak of a beginning of our consciousness? And will our consciousness ever end? I realize that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. In my recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, The Science of the Near-Death Experience, I write in many more details about my ideas about the continuity of our consciousness than I can explain here today in my lecture. And I also realize that many aspects of consciousness are still a great mystery. So let us first ask some questions about consciousness. Where am I when I'm asleep? Where is my consciousness during sleep? And according to current science, it should not be possible to experience consciousness during general anesthesia. But how could it be explained that some patients after the surgery with general anesthesia can describe into detail what has been said and done, mostly during a complication? Should we also consider the possibility of conscious experience during coma? Recently, several books were published in the Netherlands about what patients had experienced in their consciousness during coma following severe traffic accident, or during coma following complications with cerebral hypertension after surgery for a brain tumor. This last patient being declared brain dead by his neurologist and neurosurgeon. But fortunately, the family refused to give permission for organ donation, and after 3 weeks of coma, he regained consciousness. These patients reported that during the period of the coma, they had experienced clear consciousness with memories, emotions and perception out and above the body, also seeing nurses, physicians and family in and around the ICU. Does brain death really mean death? Or is it just the beginning of the process of dying that can last for hours to days? And what happens to consciousness during this period? According to the many reports of an NDE, we should consider the possibility that someone can experience consciousness during cardiac arrest. But should we also ask ourselves whether there could be still consciousness after someone really has died, when his body is cold? He who wants answers will have to ask these questions. In 1969, during my rotating internship, a patient was successfully resuscitated in the cardiac ward by electrical defibrillation after a period of unconsciousness of about 4 minutes. The patient regained consciousness, and we as resuscitation team were of course very happy. It was the beginning of the possibilities of CPR in CCUs. But the patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. He told me about going through a tunnel, seeing a light, and also beautiful colors and hearing music. I have never forgotten this event, but I did not do anything with it. And in that time I did not know that in human history the same experience has been told in many cultures and many religions and in all times, as shown in this painting from 1480 by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bos, showing deceased people escorted through a tunnel to the light. Only years later, in 1975, Raymond Moody first described the so-called near-death experiences. And only in 1986, I read about these experiences in the book by George Ritchie entitled Return from Tomorrow, which relates what he experienced during a period of clinical death of 9 minutes duration in 1943 during his medical study. And after reading this book, I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 survivors of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. For me, it all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concepts, it is not possible to experience consciousness during cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that there is a reductionist and materialistic explanation for everything, and that it was obvious that consciousness was the product of a functioning brain. And up until that point I had always accepted this as indisputable truth. But now the phenomenon of near-death experiences raised a number of fundamental questions. And NDE is a special state of consciousness that occurs during an imminent or actual period of physical, psychological or emotional death. But how and why does an NDE occur? How does the content of an NDE come about? Why does a person's life change so radically after an NDE? I was unable to accept most of the answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. But first, what is an NDE? Some people who have experienced or have survived a life-threatening crisis report an extraordinary conscious experience. An NDE can be defined as the reported memory of a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements, such as an out-of-body experience, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, or a life review. And many circumstances are described during which NDE are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, during depression or isolation, or without any obvious reason. And similar experiences to near-death ones can occur during the terminal phase of illness and are called deathbed visions or end-of-life experiences. So apparently you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report an NDE. And the NDE is transformational, always causing enhanced intuitive sensibility, profound changes in life insight, and a loss of the fear of death. And near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of the improved survival rates resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation. The content of an NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide across all cultures and in all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual, cultural, and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and to interpret the experience. Children will use different words as adults, and Christians different as atheists, Muslims, or Buddhists. They all use different words from their own religion, culture, and tradition. According to a recent at random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 9 million people in the USA and 4 million people in the UK should have had an NDE. Millions of people. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about his NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. You have to be open to hear about an NDE. Patients must feel that you trust them, that you can listen without any comment of prejudice. But for most physicians, the NDE is still an incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. Once a conference was held about NDE in a university hospital with more than 300 people in attendance. And at the end of the conference, after several lectures about NDE, a man stood up and said, "I'm a cardiologist for more than 25 years and I have never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it." And then another man got up in the audience and said, "I am one of your patients. I have had an NDE during cardiac arrest and you would be the last one I would ever tell." They know exactly that they cannot share their experience with such kind of physicians. They are not open. Until recently, there was no prospective and scientifically designed study to explain the cause and content of an NDE. All studies had been retrospective and very selective in respect to patients. Based on this incomplete retrospective studies, some believed that the experience should be caused by physiological changes in the brain as a result of lack of oxygen, cerebral anoxia. Other theories encompass a psychological reaction to approaching death, hallucinations, dreams, side effects of drugs, or just false memories. So in 1988 we started a prospective study of 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause and content of an NDE. This cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper when our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, or demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. We did a short standardized interview with sufficiently recovered patients within a few days of resuscitation and asked whether they could remember the period of unconsciousness and what they recalled. We additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interviews of all late survivors of NDE 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. We studied patients who survived a cardiac arrest because this is a well-described, life-threatening medical situation, which is also called clinical death. The definition of clinical death was used for the period of unconsciousness caused by lack of oxygen or anoxia of the brain due to arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during cardiac arrest in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. These patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model of the process of dying. In the cases where memories were reported, we coded the experiences according to a weighted core experience index. In this system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. The more elements were reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the resulting score was. We found that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of their period of unconsciousness. But 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 12% had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher, and 6% had a superficial NDE. Now, which elements were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with an NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light of observed colors. About 30% of the patients had an observation of a celestial landscape or had a meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a life review, and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE. But I know patients who had a frightening NDE. Now, what might distinguish a small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found to our surprise that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, nor the need for intubation in complicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation had any influence on the frequency of NDE. NS is not significant. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, that you know that these experiences exist, gender, religion, or education. So atheists or Christians, it didn't matter at all. We additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interviews of all late survivors of NDE 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. The study was designed to assess whether the loss of the fear of death, the transformation in attitude toward life, and enhanced intuitive sensibility is the result of having an NDE or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself. Only patients with an NDE did show this transformation. However, the integration and acceptance of an NDE is a process that may take many, many years because of the far-reaching impact on people's pre-NDE understanding of life and value system. Finally, it is quite remarkable and a surprising and unexpected finding to see a cardiac arrest lasting just a few minutes give rise to such a lifelong process of transformation. The near-death experience turns out to be a life-changing experience. The newfound insight pertains that what matters in everyday life, compassion and unconditional love for oneself, including acceptance of one's own dark side, this is already quite difficult, for others and for nature. It also pertains to insight into connectedness. Everything and everybody is connected. This is why some people describe the NDE as an experience of unity. They speak of a cosmic law in which everything they do to another person will ultimately have an effect on them too. And this applies to both love and affection, and violence and aggression. The conversations we had in our longitudinal study also revealed that people, often to their own amazement and confusion, had acquired enhanced intuitive feelings after an NDE, or as many of them put it, they had acquired paranormal gifts. This enhanced intuition is based on direct connectedness with aspects of consciousness of others, and is independent of time, inner knowing of future events or having prognostic dreams, and independent of distance, a sense of knowing about an incoming phone call, and of pain, illness, of upcoming death of people, which usually proves to be accurate. The sudden occurrence of this enhanced intuition can be quite problematic, as people suddenly have a very acute sense of others, which can be extremely intimidating. So despite the mostly positive experience, the NDE is also a traumatic event, because there is hardly any acceptance by doctors, nurses, family and partner. More than 50% get a divorce, which makes the process of acceptance and integration very difficult. And this process will take many, many years with strong feelings of depression, homesickness and loneliness. As I have said, several theories have been proposed to explain an NDE. However, in our prospective study, it could not be shown that psychological, pharmacological or physiological factors cause this experience during cardiac arrest. With a purely physiological explanation, such as lack of oxygen in the brain, most patients who had been clinical dead should report an NDE, because all patients in our study had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain resulting from the cardiac arrest. However, only 18% reported an NDE. And why only 18% report an NDE after cardiac arrest is still a big mystery. Besides, it is a well-established fact that people without any lack of oxygen in the brain, like in depression or meditation, can also experience an enhanced consciousness. Another theory holds that NDE might be a changing state of consciousness, or the theory of continuity, in which memories, identity and cognition with emotion function independently from the unconscious body and retain the possibility of extrasensory perception. Obviously, during NDE, enhanced consciousness is experienced independently from the normal body-linked waking consciousness. In 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, 1 study from the USA and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 patients. Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. The paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought processes during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation to brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. As Sempani and Peter Fennick from Southampton write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness, and this is a surprising conclusion, because when the brain is so dysfunctional that the patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences such as are reported in the NDE should not arise or be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience at all. Penny Sartori, also from England, concludes that according to the mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. With lack of evidence for any other theories for NDE, the concept thus far assumed but never scientifically proven that consciousness and memories are produced by large groups of neurons and are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG? Such a brain would be roughly analogous to a computer with its power source unplugged and its circuits detached. It couldn't hallucinate. It couldn't do anything at all. Detached. It couldn't hallucinate. It couldn't do anything at all. Furthermore, even blind people have described veridical perception during out-of-body experience at the time of their NDE. Scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. Before I discuss in greater detail some neurophysiological aspects of normal brain function and during cardiac arrest, I would like to reconsider certain elements of the NDE. First, the out-of-body experience. In this experience, people have veridical perception from a position outside and above their lifeless body. NDEs have the feeling that they have apparently taken off their body like an old coat. And to their surprise, they appear to have retained their own identity with the possibility of perception, emotions, and a very clear consciousness. This out-of-body experience is scientifically important because doctors, nurses, and relatives can verify the reported perceptions. They can also corroborate the precise moment the NDE with OBE occurred during the period of a CPR. In a recent review of 93 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body perceptions during NDE, it was found that about 90% were completely accurate. 8% contained some minor error and only 2% was complete erroneous. This proves that an OBE cannot be an hallucination, because this means experiencing perception that has no basis in reality, like in psychosis. Neither it can be a delusion, which is an incorrect assessment of a correct perception. Nor is it an illusion, which means a misapprehensive or misleading image. Should an OBE be considered as a kind of extrasensory perception? This is clearly shown in this drawing of a 6-year-old girl who nearly drowned and was resuscitated in the hospital. And in this drawing you see a happy and smiling girl watching her resuscitation from above. And this is the report of a nurse of a coronary care unit. During night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old cyanotic, comatose man into the coronary care unit. He was found in a coma about 30 minutes before in the meadow. When we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I removed these upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. Only after about an hour and a half the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure, but he is still ventilated and intubated, and he is still comatose. He is transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the necessary artificial respiration for 1 week. And after more than a week in coma, do I meet again with the patient who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he said, "Oh yes, you know where my dentures are." I am very, very surprised. Then the patient elucidates, "Yes, you were there when I was brought into hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them onto that cart. It had all those bottles on it, and there was a sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth." I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. It appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he had perceived from above how nurses and doctors had been busy with the CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and into detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated, as well as the appearances of those present, like myself. Then the holographic life review. During this life review, the subject feels the presence and renewed experience of not only every act, but also every thought from one's past life. And one realizes that all of this, it is an energy field which influences oneself as well as others. All that had been done and thought seems to be significant and stored. Because one is connected with the memories, emotions and consciousness of another person, you experience the consequences of your own thoughts, words and actions to that other person at the very moment in the past that they occurred. Interconnectedness. They understand now the cosmic law that everything one does to others will ultimately be returned to oneself. Patients survey their whole life in one glance. Time and space do not seem to exist during such an experience. Instantaneously, they are where they concentrate upon, non-locality. And they can talk for hours about the content of the life review, even though the resuscitation only took minutes. Quotation. "All of my life, up till the present, seemed to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic, three-dimensional review, and each event seemed to be accompanied by consciousness of good or evil, or with an insight into cause and effect. Not only did I perceive everything from my own viewpoint, but I also knew the thoughts of everyone involved in the event, as if I had their thoughts within me. This meant that I perceived not only what I had done or thought, but even in what way it had influenced others, as if I saw things with all-seeing eyes. And so even your thoughts are apparently not wiped out." Consider the impact of this statement for a moment. Your thoughts are never, never wiped out. And all the time during the review, the importance of love was emphasized. Looking back, I cannot say how long this life review and life insight lasted. It may have been long, for every subject came up, but at the same time, it seemed just a fraction of a second, because I perceived it all at the same moment. Time and distance seemed not to exist. I was in all places at the same time, and sometimes my attention was drawn to something and then I would be present there. And also a preview or flash forward can be experienced, in which both future images from personal life events as well as more general images from the future occur. And again, it seems as if time and space do not exist during this preview. And if deceased acquaintances of relatives are encountered in an otherworldly dimension, they are usually recognized by their appearance, and communication is possible through thought transfer. Thus, it is also possible to come into contact with the consciousness of deceased persons, interconnectedness. Quotation. During my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience. And later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who had looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship, my father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War. And my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before during my NE turned out to be my biological father. Some patients can describe how they returned into their body, mostly through the top of the head, after they had come to understand that it wasn't their time yet, or that they still had a task to fulfill. The conscious return into the body is experienced as something very oppressive. They regain consciousness in their body and realize that they are locked up in their damaged body, meaning again all the pain and restriction of their disease. About all people who have experienced an NE lose the fear of death. Quotation. It is outside my domain to discuss something that can only be proven by death. For me, however, this blessing experience was decisive in convincing me that consciousness lives on beyond the grave. And I know now for sure that body and mind are separated. Death was not death, but another form of life. So we have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, NE was experienced during a transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and of the brainstem with the flatline EEG. And because of the occasional and verifiable out-of-body experiences, we know that the NE with all the reported elements must happen during the period of unconsciousness and not in the first or last seconds of cardiac arrest. But how is it possible that a clear consciousness can be experienced outside one's body at the moment that the brain no longer functions? And how do we know that the EEG is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest? And how can we study this? Through many studies with induced cardiac arrest in both human and animal models, cerebral function has been shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing sudden loss of consciousness and of all body reflexes, but also of the abolition of brainstem activity with the loss of the gag reflex and the corneal reflex, and fixed and dilated pupils are clinical findings in those patients. And also the function of the respiratory center, located close to the brainstem, fails, resulting in apnea, no breathing. And the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, but also in the deeper structures of the brain in animals, has been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. And in acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest in the coronary care unit is usually 60 to 120 seconds, and in an out-of-hospital arrest it even takes much, much longer. So all 562 patients, survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies, must have had a flatline EEG. This conclusion is often called impossible and unscientific. The quite often proposed objection that the flatline EEG does not rule out any brain activity because it is mainly a registration of the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex misses the mark. The the issue is not whether there is any brain activity of any kind whatsoever, but whether there is brain activity of the specific form regarded by contemporary neuroscience as a necessary condition of conscious experience, with the visible activities in many neural centers. And it has been proven that there is no such specific brain activity at all during cardiac arrest. A flatline EEG is also one of the major diagnostic tools for the diagnosis of brain death, which is critical for the decision about the possibility of organ donation. And in those cases, the objection about not ruling out any brain activity whatsoever is never mentioned. The quest to find consciousness. For decades, extensive research has been done to localize consciousness and memories inside the brain. So far, without success. Also, we should ask ourselves how a non-material activity such as concentrated attention or thinking can correspond to an observable material reaction in the form of measurable electrical, magnetic and chemical activity in a certain place of the brain, or in the form of visible local changes in blood flow in the brain by an fMRI. Neuroimaging studies have shown these aforesaid changes of activities with specific areas of the brain becoming active in response to a thought or feeling. However, although providing evidence for the role of neuronal networks as an intermediary for the manifestation of thoughts, neural correlations, those studies do not imply that those cells also produce the thoughts. A correlation does not elucidate anything about cause or result. Both is possible. A neural activity can be the result of consciousness. Here, consciousness causes brain activity. Or the neural activity can be the cause of experiencing consciousness. In this option, consciousness is the product of brain function. But how should unconscious matter, like our brain, produce consciousness, while the brain only is composed of atoms and molecules in cells with a lot of chemical and electrical processes? Most of the people who carry out research into consciousness, such as neuroscientists, psychologists, psychiatrists and philosophers, are still of the opinion that there is a materialist and reductionist explanation for consciousness. They still believe that consciousness is nothing other than matter, and that our subjective experience, that our consciousness is something purely personal and differs from someone else's consciousness, is merely an illusion. According to this scientist, consciousness originates entirely from the matter that constitutes our brain. We have to admit that it is not possible to reduce consciousness to neural processes as conceived by contemporary neuroscience, because it is still an unproven assumption that consciousness and memories emerge from brain function. And until now, there is no scientific evidence for neural correlates of all aspects of subjective experience. Direct evidence of how neurons or neuronal networks could possibly produce the subjective essence of the mind and thoughts is currently lacking. We cannot measure what we think or feel. We measure just changing activation. And neural activation is simply neural activation. It only reflects the use of structures. This could be compared with a radio. You can activate the radio by turning it on. And you can activate a certain wavelength by tuning on a special channel. But you will not have any influence on the content of the program you are going to hear. Activating the radio does not influence the content of the program, and neural activation alone does not explain the content of emotions or sensations. With our current medical and scientific concepts, it seems indeed impossible to explain all aspects of subjective experiences as was reported by patients with an NDE during the transient loss of all functions of the brain. But science, I believe, is the search for explaining new mysteries rather than to stick with old facts and concepts. Frederik van Eeden, a famous Dutch MD and author, mentioned already in 1890 in his lecture about progress in current science, "Personally, I am more than ever convinced that the largest enemy of scientific progress is to reject and to refuse to study beforehand and out of prejudice seeming incomprehensible, strange and unknown facts." How up to date. And Thomas Kuhn, the famous professor of philosophy and history of science at the MIT, maintained that, contrary to popular conception, most typical scientists are not objective and independent thinkers. They try to bring the theory and facts into closer agreement according to the beforehand accepted paradigm, which Kuhn described essentially as a collection of beliefs shared by scientists, a set of agreements about how problems should be understood. As a result, scientists tend to ignore or even ridicule research findings that might threaten the existing paradigm. As William James once had said, a great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging the prejudices. And so all those observations that cannot be explained by the current worldview are called anomalies, because they are recognized as violation of the paradigm-induced expectations that govern normal science. And of course, these findings are initially overlooked, ignored, or rejected as an error. Near-death experiences are such anomalies, because the cause and content of an NDE cannot be simply explained by our current scientific ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. So it is indeed a scientific challenge to discuss new hypotheses that could explain the possibility to have clear and enhanced consciousness, with memories, with self-identity, with cognition, with emotion, with the possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body, to explain the reported interconnectedness with the consciousness of other persons and of deceased relatives, to explain the possibility to experience instantaneously and simultaneously non-locality, a review or a preview of someone's life, in a dimension without our conventional body-linked concept of time and space, where all past, present and future events exist, and even to explain the experience of the conscious return into the body. And it is important to mention that until now it has been impossible to induce a real out-of-body experience with theoretical perception from a position out and above the body by any method whatsoever, despite incorrect suggestions about the possibility in the medical literature, while just describing bodily illusions. In a recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which was a bestseller in the Netherlands with more than 100,000 copies sold within 1 year, I describe a concept in which our endless or non-local consciousness with declarative memories find its origin in and is stored in a non-local space, and the brain only serves as a relay station for parts of this non-local consciousness to be received into or as our waking consciousness. Could our brain be compared to the TV set, which receives electromagnetic waves and transforms them into image and sound? And at the same time, could it be well compared to the TV camera, which transforms image and sound into electromagnetic waves? These waves hold the essence of all information, but are only perceivable by our senses through suitable instruments like camera and TV set. The function of the brain should be compared with a transceiver, a transmitter-receiver, or interface, exactly like the function of a computer. Different neuronal networks function as interface for different aspects of our consciousness. and the function of neuronal networks should be regarded as receivers and conveyors, not as retainers of consciousness and memories. In this concept, consciousness is not rooted in the measurable domain of physics, our manifest world. This also means that our infinite or enhanced consciousness in non-local space is inherently not measurable by physical means. However, the physical aspects of consciousness, which originate from the wave aspect of our non-local consciousness through collapse of the wave function, objective reduction, can be measured by means of neuroimaging techniques like EEG, fMRI, PET scan. With this concept about non-local consciousness and its relation with the brain, all reported elements of an NDE during cardiac arrest could be explained. In trying to understand this concept of interaction between non-local or endless consciousness with the material body, it seems appropriate to compare it with modern worldwide communication. There is a continuous exchange of objective information by means of electromagnetic fields for radio, TV, mobile telephone or laptop computer. We are not consciously aware of the vast amounts of electromagnetic fields that constantly, day and night, exist around us and even permeating us. At this very moment, we are invaded by hundreds of thousands of telephone calls, by hundreds of radio and TV programs, and by innumerable websites. We only become aware of these electromagnetic informative fields at the moment we use our mobile telephone or by switching on our radio, TV or laptop. What we receive is neither inside the instrument nor in the components, but thanks to the receiver, the information from the electromagnetic fields become observable to our senses, and hence perception occurs in our consciousness. The voice we hear over our telephone is not inside the telephone. The concert we hear over radio is transmitted to our radio. The images and music we hear and see on TV are transmitted to our TV set. Internet with more than 1 billion websites can be received in our computer at about the same moment in the USA, in Europe and in Australia. It is obviously not located inside our laptop, nor is it produced by it. Having discussed the findings of several important scientific studies on NDE and its after effects, one can conclude that they challenge our current concepts about consciousness and its relation with brain function. Its conclusions are important for our scientific concepts in the Western world because this view of consciousness as a non-local phenomenon might well induce a huge change in current paradigms. Such understanding also fundamentally changes one's opinion about death, because of the almost unavoidable conclusion that at the time of physical death, consciousness will continue to be experienced in another dimension in which all past, present and future is enclosed. Quote, "Death is only the end of our physical aspects. I believe now that death, like birth, may be a mere passing from one state of consciousness into another. However, we should acknowledge that research on NDE cannot give us the irrefutable scientific proof of this conclusion, because people with an NDE did not quite die, but they all were very close to death and without a functioning brain. As I have explained, it has indeed been scientifically proven that during NDE, enhanced consciousness was experienced independently of brain function. Quoting from a recent death announcement, "All what you have falls into decay, but what you are lives on beyond time and space." So we have a body and we are conscious. Without a body we still can have a conscious experiences. Recently someone with an NDE wrote me, "I can live without my body, but apparently my body cannot live without me." One cannot avoid the conclusion that endless consciousness has and always will exist, independently from the body. There is no beginning, nor will there ever be an end to our consciousness. We asked ourselves if there is a biological basis for consciousness anyway. Yes, there is a kind of biological basis for our waking or consciousness, because our physical body functions as an interface. But no, there is no biological basis for a whole, endless or enhanced consciousness, because it is rooted in non-local space. So our enhanced consciousness resides not in our brain and is not limited to our brain, because our consciousness is non-local and our brain has a facilitating function and not a producing function to experience consciousness. So now we can conclude that our waking consciousness, which we experience as our daily consciousness, is only a part of our whole and endless or non-local consciousness. This view of a non-local consciousness allows us to understand a wide variety of special states of consciousness, just as can be experienced during a critical medical situation, an NDE, during an acute situation of apparently unavoidable death in an imminent traffic accident, and fear-death experience, during meditation or deep relaxation, and mystical, religious or enlightened experience, during changing states of consciousness during regression therapy, hypnosis, isolation, or the use of drugs like LSD or DMT, during the terminal phase of life, deathbed vision or near-death awareness or end-of-life experiences, or at the moment of death of a close relative, a shared death experience or empathetic NDE. The interconnectedness with these informative fields of non-local consciousness also explain enhanced intuition, like clairvoyance, clairaudience, prognostic dreams and visions, which is non-local information exchange. As I told before, following an NDE, most people, often to their own amazement and confusion, may experience such an enhanced intuitive sensibility, which means having access to non-local information that is not received by our senses or by our body. Presumably the functional receiving capacity of the body is permanently enhanced following an NDE, which can be compared with the radio receiving not only channel 1, your own personal consciousness, but at the same time channel 2, 3, 4 and 5, the fields of consciousness of others. William James called this a lower personal threshold of consciousness. This remote non-local communication or entanglement seems also to be demonstrated in remote viewing or non-local perception, and in the effect of consciousness on matter, like in non-local perturbation or in neuroplasticity, where functional and structural changes in the brain are demonstrated following changes in consciousness, like in meditation, mindfulness training, or placebo, which means mind over matter. The interconnectedness with non-local aspects of consciousness also explains apparitions at the moment of death, like being in contact with non-local aspects of the consciousness of a dying person at a distance, the so-called peri-mortal experience, or in the period following death, having the inner feeling of being in contact with aspects of the consciousness of the deceased relative, the so-called post-mortal experience of after-death communications, which happens so often. About 50% of people who have lost their partner and 75% of people who lost a child have this kind of after-death communication. But it is a huge taboo, they don't talk about it. It looks as if a single unusual finding that cannot be explained through widely accepted concepts and ideas is capable of bringing about a fundamental change in science. By making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local and this ubiquitous phenomenon, this view can contribute to new ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain, because it questions the purely materialistic paradigm in science. Research in NDE seems to be important for our scientific ideas about the mind-brain and mind-body relationship, and it is evident that it is also important for our concepts of life and death. but it is also very important for our health care. We should reconsider the many practical implications and ethical, medical and ethical problems, such as the care for comatose of dying patients, euthanasia, abortion, or the removal of organs for transplantation from somebody in a dying process with a beating heart in a warm body, but with the diagnosis of brain death. I believe and hope that in the near future modern science will include empirical research on unusual subjective experiences that may occur in our consciousness, that we will accept non-local concepts that understand how we are interconnected with each other, with our endangered planet. Recent research in NDE seems to be a source of new insights into the possibility of a continuity of consciousness after physical death. But the near-death experience appears to be a personal rediscovery of an age-old, cross-cultural but seemingly forgotten knowledge. In the past, these experiences were often known under different names, such as visions or mystical, religious or enlightenment experiences. And in antiquity they were referred as to journeys to the underworld. Reports of these mystical experiences, often caused by life-threatening situations such as near drowning, asphyxia, suffocation, exhaustion or high fever, have been prevalent across all times and cultures. Nowadays we would classify most of these cases as near-death experiences. So obviously near-death experiences are by no means exclusive to the past 30 years, although there has been, of course, been much more interest in the phenomenon since the publication of Raymond Moody's book Life After Life in 1975. For me personally, it was astonishing to discover so many identical experiences throughout history and across all religions and cultures. And these experiences have greatly influenced views on death and the possibility of a continuity of our consciousness after physical death. Across all times and cultures, people have been convinced that the essence of man, usually known as the soul, lives on after the death of the body. I will now quote some reports of striking similarities between near-death experiences and religious or mystical experiences from the past. In ancient India, some 3,000 years ago, it was said, "Coming and going is all pure delusion. The soul never comes nor goes. Where is the place to which it shall go when all space is in the soul? When shall be the time for the entering and departing when all time is in the soul?" And compare this quote with the modern concept of non-locality, which is a concept without a conventional bodily linked concept of time and space. And in the Upanishads, based on the Vedas, ancient Hindu stories that were passed down orally for thousands of years, it is said, "The all-knowing self was never born, nor will it die. Beyond cause and effect, this self is eternal and immutable. Where the body dies, the self does not die. The Supreme Self is beyond name and form, beyond the senses, inexhaustible, without beginning, without end, beyond time, space and causality, eternal, immutable." And in the New Testament, Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12, "I know a person in Christ who 40 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of body, I don't know, God knows. And I know that such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat." Compare this with a near-death experience. So the concept of consciousness, independent of our body, was well known for ages in all cultures and religions, especially in Eastern countries. But to my surprise, this concept happens to be not even new in our Western scientific world. Recently I came across this picture by Robert Flood, an English medical doctor who in the 17th century already located our emotional life, imaginative faculty, intellect, mental processes, memories and visions outside our brain. The drawing also clearly shows the supposed energy connections with our physical body. By quoting the Bible, Ecclesiastes, we can come to the conclusion there is nothing new under the sun. And the Dutch physician Frederik van Eeden has said, no other insight is as useful to always bear in mind, it is not new, it is age old. Since the publication of several prospective studies on NDE in survivors of cardiac arrest, with strikingly similar results and conclusions, the phenomenon of near-death experience can no longer be scientifically ignored. It is an authentic experience which cannot be simply reduced to imagination, fear of death, hallucinations, psychosis, the use of drugs, or oxygen deficiency. And people appear to be permanently changed by an NDE during cardiac arrest of only some minutes duration. According to the studies, the current materialistic view of the relationship between the brain and consciousness held by most physicians, philosophers and psychologists is too restricted for a proper understanding of this phenomenon. There are good reasons to assume that our consciousness does not always coincide with the functioning of our brain, and hence consciousness can sometimes be experienced separately from the body. I have come to the inevitable conclusion that most likely the brain must have a facilitating and not a producing function to experience consciousness. And by making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local phenomenon, we must question a purely materialistic paradigm in science. And William James, some 100 years ago, should have added, quote, first, you know, a new theory is attacked as absurd. Then it is admitted to be true, but obvious and insignificant. And finally it is seen to be so important that its adversaries claim that they themselves discovered it. For me, science means asking questions with an open mind. Science should be the search for explaining new mysteries rather than stick with old concepts. And he who has never changed his mind because he could not accept new concepts has rarely learned something. I can assure you that I learned quite a lot because of all those patients who were willing to share their NDE with me. And they have greatly influenced and changed my views on the meaning of life and death. People with a near-death experience have been my greatest teachers. I realize now that everything originates from consciousness. And I understand that people create their own subjective reality based on their consciousness and create the intention one lives his life. We should recognize that our view of the world is wrong, because we do not realize that the world as we see it only derives its subjective reality from our consciousness. Because it is only our consciousness that is determining how we perceive this world. If we are in love, the world around us is beautiful. When we are depressed, our world is like hell. And when we are frightened, made terrified by politicians and the press, our world is full of terror. The mind in its own place and in itself can make a heaven or hell, wrote John Milton even in 1667 in his poem Paradise Lost. Regarding what we can learn from people who are willing to share their NDE with others, I would like to quote Doug Hummerfield. Our ideas about death define how we live our life. Because as long as we believe that death is the end of everything we are, we will give our energy toward the temporary and material aspects of our life. And our approach to actual medical and ethical problems is shaped in part by our belief in a possible continuity of consciousness after physical death, or in contrast, by our conviction that death is the end of everything. These views are usually based on religious beliefs or the lack thereof. In our short-sightedness and sometimes willful ignorance, we forget to reflect the future of our planet, where our children and our grandchildren will have to live and survive. We forget about the sustainability, as we are now destroying and exhausting systematically our planet, just because we are living in a competitive, materialistic society. We should realize that the harm we cause to each other and to nature ultimately is harming ourselves, because we as humans are not only intensively interconnected and tangled with each other, but also with animals and plants living on our endangered earth. We should stop thinking and acting as if we are better than others, because this will always be at the expense of children and other weak, delicate creatures around the world. We have to change our personal consciousness, not only to change the way we live, but also to change the way we want to treat, honor and respect other human beings on this planet. When the power of love becomes stronger than our love for power, our world will change. And it will require a huge change in consciousness indeed. We should all feel the responsibility for this change. Thank you for your attention.